I remember the exact quality of the silence in our house that night. Not peaceful silence, the other kind. The kind that presses against your ears like something waiting. I'm Ethan, and the night I found the email was a Tuesday in October, 11:53 in the evening, with rain moving quietly against the windows and my daughter asleep down the hall. I'm 32 years old. I design buildings for a living, residential architecture, mostly, the kind of work that requires you to think carefully about how spaces hold people, how structure and light and proportion work together to create something that feels like home. I was good at it. I believed, genuinely, that I was equally good at building the other things in my life that mattered. My marriage. My family. The particular shape of the future Sarah and I had been constructing together since we were 23 years old. Sarah and I met in our junior year of college. She was sitting 3 rows ahead of me in an urban theory seminar, arguing with the professor about whether architecture was inherently political, and she was right, and I spent the next 4 years trying to keep up with how quickly her mind moved. We married at 26. For 6 years, the marriage was the structure I trusted most, the one I'd checked most carefully, the one I believed in the way you believe in a thing you helped build from the foundation. Mia arrived in April. 6 months before that October night, she came into the world at 5:42 in the morning, small and certain and entirely herself, and I stood in the delivery room with my hand against Sarah's shoulder and felt something I had no adequate name for. The particular completeness of a man who believes he has everything. That belief was still intact at 11:53 on a Tuesday in October when I sat down at the kitchen table to finish a set of drawings I'd left open on my laptop, reached for the wrong machine in the low light, and opened Sarah's instead. The screen came alive. Her email was open. I saw the subject line before I could look away, last night. The sender's name was Connor. I sat very still for what felt like a long time. The rain continued against the glass. Somewhere in the house, the refrigerator cycled on with a low hum. I read 3 sentences of that email, and then I closed the laptop very carefully, as if the gentleness of the motion might contain what I'd just seen. It didn't. I didn't sleep that night. I lay beside Sarah in the dark and listened to her breathe and tried to locate the version of myself that had existed 4 hours earlier, the one who had come upstairs to check on Mia and found her curled and sleeping and felt nothing but gratitude. That version of me was gone. I hadn't understood yet exactly how completely, but I felt its absence already, a specific vacancy, like a room where the furniture has been moved and the outline on the carpet is all that remains. Sarah slept easily. That registered somewhere below the level of thought and stayed there. By 6 in the morning I was dressed and downstairs, and by the time Sarah came down with Mia on her hip I had coffee ready and a face that gave nothing away. I had decided, in the hours between midnight and dawn, that I would not react before I understood. That instinct, the architect's instinct, really, the preference for full information before drawing conclusions, probably saved me from a confrontation I wasn't equipped to have yet. It also cost me weeks of proximity to a person who had already become, in some fundamental way, a stranger. "You're up early," she said. "Drawings due Thursday," I said. "Coffee's fresh." She poured a cup one-handed, Mia balanced on her opposite hip with the practiced ease of 6 months of motherhood. She looked like everything she'd always looked like, warm, competent, certain of her place in the morning. The performance was flawless. Which told me, later, that it had been running for a long time. Looking back now, that morning was the first of many times I would understand something I should have understood earlier: a person who can sleep soundly beside you while carrying what she was carrying is not just deceitful. They are practiced. The lie had been running long enough to feel like the truth. I kissed her on the cheek. I kissed Mia on the top of her head. I went to the studio in the spare bedroom and sat at my actual laptop and stared at drawings I couldn't see, and began, very quietly, to think about what came next. The month before I found the email, our life had looked exactly right from the outside. Saturday mornings with Mia in the carrier while we walked to the farmer's market. Dinners that Sarah cooked with the particular focused pleasure she brought to anything she decided to do well. Friends coming over, evenings that went past midnight, laughter that sounded real because most of it was. We were the couple that other people pointed to, carefully, as an example, college sweethearts who'd made it work, who had the baby and the house and the careers and the energy to sustain all of it simultaneously. I was proud of that. I want to be honest about that particular vanity, because it matters. I was proud of the image, and pride in an image is a specific form of blindness. Sarah worked in marketing, freelance, which gave her flexible hours and a social calendar I didn't always track closely. She had a circle of friends I knew by name and broad outline but not in detail, her college network, mostly, people she'd stayed close to through group chats and occasional gatherings I was sometimes invited to and sometimes not. That was normal. People have lives that don't fully overlap with their partners. I never thought to question the topology of hers. But there had been signals. I can see them now with the clarity of someone who has been forced to stop choosing not to see. The book club started in February, 8 months before I found the email. 3, sometimes 4 evenings a month, organized by a woman named Priya whom I'd met once at a birthday gathering and found perfectly pleasant and unremarkable. Sarah mentioned Priya often enough in the right contexts that the name became familiar, comfortable, a regular piece of the landscape. Priya's hosting this month. Priya changed the date. Priya picked a novel I'm not sure about. I called it a book club then. I wouldn't call it that anymore. Looking back, the frequency was wrong, most book clubs meet once a month. The timing was wrong, she left at 7 and returned after midnight, flushed and slightly over-animated in ways I attributed to wine and good conversation. And when I once asked what they'd read, she told me the title of a novel I'd seen on our own shelf for 2 years, which meant she already owned it, which meant she wasn't borrowing it from the host. I filed that detail under coincidence and kept moving. The phone was the second signal. She'd always been comfortable leaving it on the counter, screen up, visible and unremarkable. At some point in the spring, around March, I think, though I can't be certain, that changed. Face down on every surface. Taken to the bathroom. Charged in the kitchen rather than on the nightstand, which she explained as better sleep hygiene, which was plausible enough that I accepted it without examination. I accepted a great many things without examination that spring and summer. The third signal was harder to name because it lived in texture rather than fact. She was warm with me, present, engaged, but there were moments when I had the sensation of talking to someone who was also listening to a different conversation happening somewhere else. Not distracted exactly. More like distributed. As if part of her attention had been permanently reassigned. I read it as postpartum adjustment. Parenthood was large and new and demanding. Of course we were both distributed. Of course the margins of our attention had been reallocated. I was so convinced this was the explanation that I used it actively, cited it to myself whenever something felt slightly off, pressed it into service as a general-purpose reassurance. I didn't ask questions because I believed I already had the answers. That's the specific arrogance I carried into those months, not cruelty, not negligence, just the comfortable certainty of a man who thought he understood his life clearly enough that additional examination was unnecessary. An architect who stops checking his own load-bearing walls eventually finds out why that was a mistake. The name Connor entered my conscious awareness for the first time in July, though I can now confirm he'd been in the story considerably longer. Sarah mentioned him over dinner, a contact, she said, someone in brand consulting who'd referred a client her way. She said his name once, in a sentence, and moved on, and I registered it the way you register the name of someone who has no claim on your attention. Peripheral. Temporary. He came up again in August. A networking event she was attending, she'd mentioned him in the context of who else would be there. I remember thinking he sounded competent, the way you think about people who exist only as names in other people's sentences. 2 months later, his name was in a subject line that rearranged everything. After the night I found the email, I went back through what I remembered of those mentions with a forensic attention I hadn't applied the first time. The way she'd said his name, casually, yes, but with a particular smoothness, the kind that comes from practice. The way she'd moved past it, given it no weight, the way you give no weight to something you need your audience to forget. She was good at this. She had been good at this for longer than I'd known there was something to be good at. I spent the 3 days after finding the email in a state of surface normalcy that cost me more energy than anything I'd ever done professionally. Conversations about Mia's sleep schedule, grocery lists, a project I was working on. I functioned correctly. I said the right things. I watched Sarah constantly from behind the performance of ordinariness, and I learned things I hadn't known to look for before. The phone, always. The slight recalibration when she came back from the bathroom, the micro-pause before answering questions that should have been simple. The way she looked at Mia, that part was genuinely real, I was certain of it, the love was authentic, and that made the rest of it more complicated rather than less. A person can love their child sincerely and simultaneously be conducting a sustained deception. The two don't cancel each other out. On the 4th day, I called Ray. Ray had been recommended by a colleague who'd gone through a difficult divorce 3 years earlier and mentioned his name with the particular discretion of someone passing on information they hoped you'd never need. He was 51, methodical, former law enforcement, and he answered his phone on the second ring with a directness that I found immediately grounding. I met him at a coffee shop downtown, chose a corner table, and told him the minimum necessary. I had reason to believe my wife was involved with another man and I needed to know the extent of it. He asked 3 questions. He told me his rate. He told me what he would deliver and in what time frame. One more thing, I said, as we were finishing. I said it carefully, because it was the hardest thing I'd said out loud since the night with the email. There's a paternity question. Ray looked at me for a moment. His expression didn't change. I can include that, he said. It's additional. Include it, I said. I drove home through city traffic with both hands on the wheel and something that felt like the absence of all feeling sitting where my chest usually was. I had set a process in motion. There was no comfortable version of what came next. That was the moment I understood something I've never been able to fully articulate since. The thing I was most afraid of wasn't the affair. Affairs are a known category of human failure, terrible, but mappable. What I was most afraid of was Mia. The question I'd put on Ray's list. The thing I hadn't let myself think fully yet but that had arrived, unbidden, in the small hours of the night I found the email and had not left since. The book club evening 2 weeks into Ray's investigation gave me the first real confirmation of what I already knew but had not yet had documented. Sarah left at 7:15 with her usual ease, her bag over one shoulder, a reference to Priya's apartment. I waited 20 minutes. Then I called Priya. Priya answered on the 4th ring, sounding slightly surprised. In the background I could hear what sounded like a television, a quiet domestic evening. I told her I was trying to reach Sarah, that she wasn't answering her phone, that I was sorry to bother her. Sarah? Priya said. There was a small pause. Not guilty, confused. She's not here tonight. We haven't met in a couple of months actually, I think the group kind of, she stopped herself. Is everything okay? Fine, I said. I must have the dates mixed up. Sorry to interrupt. I set my phone down on the kitchen counter. Mia was in the bouncer by the window, making small exploratory sounds at the evening light. I stood very still and looked at her and felt the particular quality of a truth arriving that you have been holding at distance for too long. She was gone until 11:40. She came home smelling of wine and something else I hadn't identified before but identified now. She kissed my cheek and called me by the name she always used and went to check on Mia, and I sat in the living room with my hands folded in my lap and kept very, very still. I had spent months choosing comfort over clarity. That phone call to Priya was the moment that choice became permanently unavailable. Once you know a thing with that kind of specificity, you cannot unknow it. The book club had never existed. Every Tuesday and Thursday and occasional Saturday she'd attended it had been something else entirely. What do you do with 8 months of a lie that specific? You do what I did, you write it down, and you keep going. Ray called me 12 days later. "Can you meet?" he said. We sat at the same corner table. He placed a folder in front of me and folded his hands on top of it. "Before I open this," he said, "I want to make sure you're prepared for the full scope of what's in here. Some of it you're expecting. Some of it you may not be." "Open it," I said. He did. Ray's report was 41 pages. I know that because I counted them, later, in my car, before I drove home. 41 pages of photographs, financial records, hotel receipts, transcribed text messages obtained through means I didn't ask him to specify, and at the very back, behind a divider marked with a small tab, a document from a private laboratory. Connor. 40 years old. Brand consultant, partner at a mid-size firm downtown. Married, his wife's name was Julia, and she appeared in 3 photographs at what looked like a company event, standing beside him with the particular ease of someone who believes her life is what it appears to be. I recognized that ease. I had worn it myself. The affair had begun 14 months ago. Not 8, as I'd been calculating from the book club's inception. 14. Which meant it had started 6 months before the book club cover story was constructed, which meant there had been an earlier infrastructure of lies I hadn't identified at all. The thing that hit me hardest in that folder wasn't the photographs, I'd braced for those. It was the timeline. 14 months. Mia was 6 months old. The math was immediate and brutal, and I sat with it in Ray's presence without saying anything for almost a full minute. The financial records were the secondary devastation, arriving just as I'd begun to absorb the first. Sarah had a personal account I'd known about, ordinary, unremarkable, the kind of separate account most couples maintain without drama. What I hadn't known was the pattern of transfers into it over the preceding year. Small amounts, consistently, drawn from our joint account in amounts calibrated to avoid triggering any notification threshold. Accumulated, they amounted to just over $22,000. Not a theft. A preparation. She had been preparing for something. I didn't know yet whether she was preparing to leave me or preparing to be left, but she had been moving money quietly and consistently for 12 months, and that told me something about the architecture of her intentions that the affair alone had not. The paternity result was on the last page. Ray didn't say anything while I read it. He poured water from the carafe on the table and slid the glass toward me, which was the most human gesture of the entire meeting, and I was briefly and absurdly grateful for it. The probability figure was expressed as a percentage. It was not a percentage that admitted ambiguity. Mia was not my biological daughter. I sat with that sentence for a long time. I turned it over carefully, the way you handle something fragile, looking for a side of it that hurt less. There wasn't one. But there was, beneath the initial devastation, something unexpected, a slow, arriving certainty that this fact changed nothing about how I felt about her. She was 6 months old and she was my daughter in the only sense that had ever mattered to me, and no document was going to alter the specific weight of her in my arms at 5:42 in the morning when she arrived, and I understood what completeness felt like. That realization took an hour to reach. The first hour was just the number on the page. I understood something in that moment that I've carried since. Biological fact and emotional truth are not the same category of information. The science told me one thing. My heart had already told me another, in April, in a delivery room, and the two would have to coexist without resolving. Most of the important things in life are like that. I drove home with the folder in my bag and Mia on my mind and a plan beginning to form that I hadn't consciously started building, but that was apparently already under construction in some back part of my brain that had been working while the front part was absorbing data. The plan had several components, and I executed them in sequence over the following 10 days. First, I contacted a lawyer. Her name was Sandra, and she came recommended by 2 separate colleagues as the person you wanted in your corner for a situation that involved children, financial complications, and a spouse who had demonstrated a talent for sustained deception. I met with her for 90 minutes. She asked precise questions. She told me what the financial transfers meant legally, what the paternity situation meant for custody, and what my strongest position looked like. I left with clarity I hadn't expected to feel, the particular clarity of having a problem that was terrible but mappable. Second, I opened a personal account and arranged a series of transfers that Sandra had confirmed were legally appropriate given the documented withdrawals from the joint account. I was not draining us, I was equalizing. The distinction mattered to me practically and morally. Third, I wrote letters. Not to Sarah. To our families. To the friends who had been part of our life together and who I believed deserved the truth before the story arrived in whatever form Sarah chose to deliver it. The letters were factual, not vindictive. They named what had happened, the affair's duration, the financial situation, the paternity, and they asked for nothing except acknowledgement. I sealed them and held them. And fourth, I wrote a note. 4 words. I left it on the kitchen counter under her coffee mug on a Thursday morning while she was in the shower and Mia was still asleep. I know. Don't search. Then I took a bag I'd packed the previous night and I left. I stayed with my college friend Patrick for the first week, a choice I'd made deliberately, someone outside the immediate social circle Sarah and I shared, someone she'd have no easy path to through mutual connections. Patrick asked no questions the first evening. He made dinner, we watched something I couldn't follow, and he let the silence be what it was. The morning after I left, I sent the letters. I had been deliberate about the sequence. Sarah's mother Diane would receive hers before anyone else. Diane was a woman I'd genuinely liked across 6 years of family dinners and holidays and the specific intimacy of watching her hold Mia for the first time in the hospital. She was sharp, clear-eyed, not given to sentimentality when clarity was required. I suspected she would be devastated by the contents of the letter. I was right. She called me 2 days after it arrived. Ethan. Her voice was the voice of a woman who has processed something and arrived at a decision about it. I want you to know I believe you. And I want you to know that what she did, all of it, there's no version of this where she was right. Thank you, I said. Mia, she said. There was a pause. Whatever happens with everything else. Mia is your daughter. She always will be. I had to set the phone down for a moment after that. Sarah called 17 times the day I left. I know because my phone registered each one. I didn't answer any of them. On the second day she sent a message that was 7 paragraphs long and that I read once and then did not read again. It moved through denial to anger to something that looked like grief, and I had no doubt that the grief was real. What I was less certain about was what exactly she was grieving, the marriage, or the specific arrangement of her life that the marriage had provided. On the third day, Connor's wife Julia called me. I had not sent her a letter. I had debated it and decided against, not to protect Connor, but because Julia was a person I'd never met and the information she needed to receive about her own marriage was not mine to deliver. She had apparently received it anyway, through whatever chain of consequence the letters to our shared social world had set in motion. I don't know what to say to you, she said. She sounded exhausted in a specific way I recognized. I just needed to, I don't know. I needed to talk to someone who understood what this is. I know what it is, I said. We talked for 40 minutes. I don't remember most of what we said, but I remember that it helped in an unexpected way, not because misery shared is misery halved, which is a lie, but because speaking with someone navigating the same wreckage confirmed that what I was feeling was proportionate. That I wasn't collapsed or catastrophizing. That this was, simply, as bad as it felt. I saw Sarah for the first time in person 11 days after I left, at the apartment, which I'd arranged through the lawyer to retrieve additional belongings. She was there because she'd asked to be, and I'd agreed because some part of me understood that the conversation needed to happen in physical space to be real. She looked like someone who had not slept in 11 days, which she probably hadn't. She looked like someone trying to locate the version of herself that would say the right thing. I recognized that effort because I'd been making a parallel one. Ethan, she said. And then stopped. I have Ray's report, I said. All 41 pages. I have the financial records. I have the paternity test. She closed her eyes. How long have you known? About the email, 3 weeks. About everything else, 12 days. She sat down on the arm of the sofa, which was a thing she did when she was genuinely distressed, that specific posture. I didn't plan any of this, she said. I need you to know that. I believe you, I said. People rarely plan their way into 14 months of sustained deception. They just keep not stopping. She flinched. It wasn't said cruelly, it was said accurately, and accuracy lands harder than cruelty sometimes. What happens now, she said. Divorce, I said. The lawyer has the paperwork started. You'll receive documents this week. And Mia? Something tightened in my chest at the sound of her name in this conversation, the collision of the two things that mattered most, arriving at the same intersection at the same time. Mia is my daughter, I said. Whatever the biology says. I will be in her life. Full stop. We'll work out the arrangement through the lawyers, and I'm willing to be reasonable about access and scheduling. What I'm not willing to do is disappear from her life because of what you did. Sarah was crying by this point, quietly, in the way of someone who has been crying intermittently for 11 days and has no reserves left for dramatic expression. I'm sorry, she said. I know that's not. It's enough for right now, I said. And I meant it. Not as forgiveness, I was nowhere near forgiveness yet, and I didn't pretend otherwise. But I wasn't interested in extending the pain of the conversation beyond what it needed to be. I had said what I came to say. I picked up the bag I'd come for and I left. The day the divorce was filed, I sent Ray a brief message thanking him for the work. He responded with 2 sentences and a line that I've carried since: you handled it well. Most people don't. I wasn't sure I had handled it well. I'd handled it deliberately, which is adjacent but not identical. There were moments in those weeks where the deliberateness had cost me, moments where what I actually felt had been subordinated to the plan, to the sequence of actions, to the careful management of consequence. I wasn't certain that was entirely healthy. But it had kept me functional, and functional was what Mia needed from me. I realized, in the weeks after the filing, that I had spent years defining myself in relation to the marriage, as a husband, as part of a unit, as a half of something. The process of dismantling that structure forced me to locate what was underneath it, which was just me, alone, with a set of skills and values and capacities that existed independently of anyone else's choices. That discovery was frightening and clarifying in equal measure. A year is not a long time. I want to say that without sentimentality, just as a fact, 1 year is not sufficient to fully rebuild something that took a decade to construct. What it is sufficient for is establishing the foundation, finding the shape of a life that is genuinely yours, not assembled from the wreckage of someone else's decisions about you. The divorce was finalized 7 months after I filed. Sandra had been correct about my position, and the settlement reflected the documented financial irregularities in ways that were fair without being punitive. I didn't want punishment. I wanted accuracy, an honest accounting of what had actually happened. Mia turned 18 months old in October of the following year, walking now with the particular determined wobble of a toddler who has recently discovered that legs are useful and is not yet entirely certain of their mechanics. She called me Da in a voice that had no idea it was doing anything significant. She did it constantly. Every time she did, something inside me that had been compressed and tight for a year released slightly further. I had legal guardianship. Sarah had access, generous, regular, structured access, because whatever she had done to me, she was Mia's mother and Mia needed her. Diane helped. She had become, in the aftermath of everything, a consistent presence in Mia's life and in mine, not out of obligation or guilt for her daughter's choices, but out of the particular love of a grandmother who had decided that the child mattered more than the complications surrounding her. Connor's name disappeared from the story completely after the divorce proceedings began. Whatever had existed between him and Sarah apparently did not survive exposure to daylight, a common enough outcome for things built in shadow. Julia's name also faded, which was appropriate. We had served a specific purpose for each other in the worst weeks, and we had both moved on. I went back to work with a focus that surprised me. The grief, when it came, and it came, in waves, at irregular intervals, triggered by things as ordinary as a particular quality of Saturday morning light, didn't incapacitate me the way I'd feared it would. It arrived, it moved through me, it left. I learned to let it do that without fighting it. The projects I worked on in that year were the best work I'd done. I don't say that as consolation or as the silver lining of a terrible experience. I say it because it was true, and I think it was true because I was working without the subtle but constant energy drain of maintaining something that had been broken for longer than I'd known. Clarity, even painful clarity, creates room. Patrick remained a constant. 2 other friends, people from before Sarah and I were together, from the years when my life was entirely my own, re-entered my orbit in the way that old friendships do when the specific social gravity of a marriage is removed. I hadn't realized how much of my time and attention had been organized around the couple-shaped unit we presented to the world, and how many individual threads had quietly frayed as a result. I was eating dinner with Patrick on a Wednesday in March, 8 months after the divorce was finalized, when he introduced me to a woman named Laura who worked with him at his firm. She was a structural engineer. She argued with him about a calculation on a napkin over pasta. She was right about the calculation, and she knew it, and she didn't soften the rightness for social comfort. I thought, watching her, that this was how it starts. Quietly. Sideways. Without announcement. We talked for an hour after Patrick excused himself with the particular satisfied air of someone who has engineered a situation and is pleased with the result. She had a daughter from a previous relationship, she mentioned, 4 years old, complicated co-parenting arrangement, navigated with the pragmatic steadiness she apparently brought to everything. She asked about my situation with the directness of someone who had been through her own version of complicated and had no interest in circling things. I told her the broad shape of it, not all of it, not then. But the shape. She listened without expressions of horrified sympathy, which was the right response, and when I finished she said, "Children are resilient when the adults around them do the work." Sounds like you're doing the work. Trying to, I said. That's all there is, she said. We had dinner the following week. And the week after that. And eventually, with the particular unhurried patience of 2 people who have been through enough to know that rushing things is how they break, something began. Sarah tracked me down 18 months after the divorce, on a Tuesday afternoon. She called from a number I didn't recognize, which was how the call got through. She was in therapy, she said. She was working on herself. She wanted to say things she hadn't said in the apartment that day when I came for my bag. She sounded different, cleaner somehow, more present, less performed. I listened. I said what was true, which was that I had arrived at a place beyond anger, that I held no active wish for her unhappiness, and that what mattered to me now was Mia and the quality of the life I was building. "Are you okay?" she asked. It was a genuine question, not a strategic one. "Yes," I said. "Actually yes." She was quiet for a moment. "I'm glad," she said. And she meant it. We said goodbye and I sat with the phone in my hand for a moment, taking stock of what I felt. Not nothing, a residue of something, the particular texture of a thing that happened to you and mattered, that changed you and costs you something to remember. But underneath it, and considerably larger, something that had taken more than a year to grow into its current size. Peace. The specific peace of a man who knows exactly who he is, what he values, and what he's willing to accept, and who wakes up every morning in a life he has chosen rather than inherited. Mia was walking confidently by then. She had a way of stopping mid-stride to examine something on the ground, a leaf, a pebble, a crack in the pavement, that arrested me completely every time I saw it. The concentrated attention of a child discovering the world. I took her to the park on Sunday mornings, the 2 of us, and pushed her on the swing until she laughed, and watched her examine things she found fascinating, and thought about how love of this kind, this specific, uncomplicated, primary love, was something no piece of paper had ever really been relevant to. She pointed at something in a bush one Sunday and looked back at me with absolute certainty that this required my attention. "I see it," I said. She pointed again, more emphatically. "I see it," I said. "You're right. It's important." She looked satisfied. She went back to looking. I stood in the October light with my hands in my pockets and thought that this, right here, was the structure I'd been building toward without knowing it. Not the marriage I'd lost. Not the image I'd maintained. This. The real thing. The load-bearing thing. The thing that held. The most painful detail in this story is not the affair. It's the $22,000. The money represents something qualitatively different from everything else Sarah did. It represents forward planning, a deliberate and sustained act of preparation that required her to imagine a future that did not include Ethan and to build toward it quietly, over 12 months, in increments designed not to be noticed. An affair can emerge from weakness or confusion or any number of recognizably human failures. A methodically constructed financial exit strategy is something else. It is a decision, made and remade daily, to build a private future while inhabiting a shared one. That's the thing about sustained deception at this level, it's not a single moral failure. It's an ongoing one, repeated every morning when you get up and behave as if the architecture of your actual intentions is not running underneath the architecture of your presented life. Sarah did that for over a year. She did it while pregnant. She did it while introducing her husband to their newborn daughter at 5:42 in the morning. The capacity required for that kind of parallel living is significant, and understanding it without excusing it is important to understanding what actually happened. What the story illuminates, beyond its specific events, is how completely trust can neutralize the perception of evidence. Ethan was not an inattentive man, he was an architect, professionally trained to notice structural details, to identify when something doesn't align. Yet the book club ran for 8 months before he questioned it. The phone behavior registered and was dismissed. The financial withdrawals accumulated unseen. Every single signal was present and observable, and every single one was filtered through the assumption of a trustworthy partner and rendered invisible. This isn't stupidity. It's what psychologists call confirmation bias operating at an intimate scale, the tendency to interpret incoming information in ways that confirm an existing belief. Ethan believed in his marriage. Every piece of data that arrived was unconsciously sorted into the category of compatible with a good marriage rather than examined on its own terms. It takes an enormous amount of evidence, or a very specific piece of it, to break that sorting mechanism. For Ethan, it was 3 sentences in an email at midnight. What he did with that break is where his character becomes fully visible. He didn't react. He didn't confront. He gathered information with the same methodical attention he brought to professional work, he engaged appropriate support, and he made decisions that were clear-eyed about both his own interests and Mia's. That's not coldness, it's a man who understands that decisions made in the grip of maximum emotion are rarely the best ones, and who had enough self-knowledge to wait until he could see clearly. The paternity question adds a layer that the story never allows to become the central one, which is the right choice. Ethan's refusal to let biological fact override emotional reality, his insistence that Mia was his daughter in the only sense that mattered, is the moral center of the narrative. It's easy to love a child who is unambiguously yours. What Ethan chose was harder and more deliberate, to love a child with full knowledge of the complexity, because the love had preceded the knowledge and was not conditional on it. Whether he would do that if he were starting from zero, if Mia had been handed to him as a stranger's child, not as the daughter he'd held since April, is a question the story wisely doesn't answer. What it shows instead is a man for whom the emotional truth of a relationship had already outpaced the legal and biological categories, and who chose to honor that. The opening toward Laura at the end is not a resolution. It's a possibility. And that's the right note, not a restored life, not a recovered marriage, not triumphant happiness after suffering, but the specific modest hope of a person who has done the work and is, carefully, open to what comes next. What I keep coming back to, sitting with this story, is the image of Ethan reading that paternity report in Ray's office. Not the affair, the report. Because at that moment, the thing being destroyed wasn't just his marriage. It was his understanding of who he was in the world, a husband, a father, a man whose family was exactly what he believed it to be. All three, simultaneously, gone. And he still drove home. He still walked in. He still looked at Mia in her bouncer by the window and let the love be larger than the devastation. That's not something you plan. That's character, revealed under pressure. And I think that's the thing worth holding onto from this story, not the betrayal, not the consequences, but the quiet, stubborn fact of a man who chose, in the worst moment, to be who he actually was.